Should come on any second now.
Thank you. And again, while you're setting that up, so yes, if you're just arriving, please put any questions in the Q&A if you have access to it. Thank you, recording started, or questions in the chat with the word question before it. So good evening, everybody, and thank you to so many of you for coming along to this Viability in Development webinar. We were amazed actually how interested people were in this, and it's obviously a really important topic. And it's important because it affects all of us. Viability affects the promises that developers make and what they actually deliver in the end. So if developers renegotiate, as can occasionally happen, quite a lot, then it's the communities that lose out because they don't get the affordable housing or the infrastructure. And I saw it firsthand in North Essex when I first got into campaigning with my campaign group, and I know a couple of them are here today, that viability was absolutely crucial to the delivery or non-delivery, as it happened, of some garden communities. So it is a really important topic, and it's a not well understood topic. So the reason we set this webinar up today is because we want to help communities and planning officers and councillors to better understand viability in planning. And we want to try and level the playing field. So we're very thankful to have Murray Lloyd here today. He's a director of Continuum, a 30-year track record of viability appraisals and analysis, all types of development. He is a leading practitioner in the field, and he's even doing a PhD at the moment. So before I hand to Murray, I was just going to say I'm relieved that I thought with the current government consultation on viability, which was launched a couple of days ago, I have been worried that maybe it would put people like Murray out of a job, because it was supposed to be a single infrastructure levy, a set fee, all very simple, all lovely. In fact, the consultation, which is running to the 9th of June, and I'll put the link into the chat in a minute, it actually makes things much more complicated. There is a flat levy, a single infrastructure levy, but Section 106 will remain. You'll have delivery agreements for some infrastructure. You'll have some infrastructure delivered via planning conditions. So I'm not here to talk about that tonight, but just to say that the new consultation for the infrastructure levy is well worth looking at. It is supposed to be a new and better world, but I think actually it's going to make things much more complicated and keep people like Murray employed for quite some time. So with no further ado, I'm going to hand over to Murray. If you have questions while he's talking, please put them in the chat with question or Q&A, and we will try and ask some as we go along. But there are quite a lot of you here, so we might have to put some of them towards the end, but we will try and pick some out that's relevant. So thank you very much, and Murray, over to you.
Good afternoon, good early evening, everybody. I speak to you here from next to the river in the River Aire in the centre of Leeds. My colleague Chris Gardner, a fellow viability practitioner, is with me. I need somebody to help me with the tech, but I also need his brains as well. Chris and I have been lecturing and presenting on viability for quite some years now, and we have developed a presentation which is primarily for planning practitioners and also planning committee members to hopefully try and chart them through what is it's a challenging arena. By its very nature, it is complex to work out what it is that viability does, what's its purpose, and how best to understand what its conclusions actually mean. So without further ado, Chris, if you could just a little bit of an intro.
Murray, yeah? Sorry. Apparently the audio is not great for some people. Would it be possible to be a little closer to your microphone?
Yeah, sure.
Thank you.
Hopefully that's better.
That is better. Thank you.
Okay, right. So I'll be in this peculiar leaning over position, but that's fine. So as I say, just a little intro in terms of the business that Chris and I are part of. It's called Continuum, and we specialise in development, primarily advising the public sector, and through our work in development, we've been asked to look into viability for our clients, and we've developed a core expertise in the subject over recent years. Next slide, please, Chris. And again, just a bit of an explanation about the business. Move on. Just some of the local authorities that we operate, that we work with. As you can see, we've got quite a geographical spread across England. So, evidently, this is, as Rosie said, this is a subject that people are genuinely interested in, but don't necessarily understandably don't have the knowledge base which allows them to fully interrogate what it is that's being presented when it comes to viability and planning applications and viability through the plan system. So clearly in the UK, we have a plan-led system, and that plan-led system sets the agenda for a place over roughly a 15-year period, a standard plan period. And those plans are required to be tested for deliverability, I think is the best way of describing it, so that if sites are to be allocated through a plan for employment use, for residential use, then it needs to be understood if they are deliverable, and there needs to be a test of viability as part of that. So looking at the financial constraints and the outputs from development, will that be sufficient to entice landowners to promote land, to entice developers to undertake development, and still for the schemes to be brought forward whilst policy requirements as set through the plan are met. And that is a part of this. That has been part of the system in England and Wales for quite some time. Clearly, with regards to changes that have been made, the coalition government 2012 came to power at a time of economic distress, should we call it, and that there were many challenges with regards to how to get Britain back building again, because the housing numbers being delivered post the 2008 crash were at an all-time low, sort of post the First World War, and the National Planning Policy Framework, which was a bonfire of the chapters, was reducing down thousands and thousands of pages of policy into something that was meant to be simple and easy to use. Now, from the perspective of viability, the big change that happened in 2012 and the MPPF was the presumption in favour of development and an emphasis on schemes being economically viable, and that developers and landowners need to see competitive returns as part of the process. And should there not be equilibrium between a developer's requirement for profit, a landowner's requirement for return for their land, for all the costs that are required in terms of delivering development, and then also the contributions to infrastructure that would compensate or mitigate against the harm caused by that development, then there was, in terms of the planning balance, the ability for developers, landowners, to actually challenge through the appeal system any schemes that were refused on the grounds of viability, which was the fundamental change in the MPPF. So the one thing that was, I think Chris and I would say was missing largely from the 2012 document was an attempt to define what a competitive return was. Clearly, the Harman Report 2014 made an attempt, but with regards to the MPPF and the PPG that came along with it, the planning policy guidance, there was no really defined approach to what a competitive return was, and that then basically ensued the 2012 to 2018 period, which I often refer to as the Wild West when it comes to viability, because that was a time where people were largely guessing about what competitive returns meant. and what was fair and reasonable. Next slide, please, Chris. So the major change in 2018 was the revised National Planning Policy Framework and its associated planning policy guidance. And a lot of the rationale behind the change came from something called the Parkhurst decision, which is really a High Court judge determining that there needed to be a much more informed assessment provided for those who were working in the area of viability and planning, far more guidance with regards to, for instance, what was a competitive return to a developer, what should the expectation for a landowner be, because if anybody who's worked in the field will have heard of the term circularity, where clearly this was a technique used by those operating primarily on behalf of developers and landowners to achieve the desired outcome, which was reduce contributions, maximise returns, and still get a planning consent. So what was done to try to remedy, in terms of the sheriff entering the town in this period of the Wild West? So benchmark land values, again, anybody who's involved in viability and planning will have heard that term, and existing use value plus methodology in terms of the identification of a premium. The removal of the phrase competitive returns from reference in the PPG, now referred to by the word aspiration, a really important change which I've not seen really followed through. A lot of people are still, when dealing with viability cases, make the reference to competitive returns for, say, it's not there anymore. And I think point three, I think, is a really important one as far as I'm concerned, because this was an attempt to define what the process is. So viability, a balance between the aspirations of developer and landowner and the aims of the planning system to secure maximum benefits in the public interest. And that's, since 2018, I think there has been a realignment in some places, not all, to try and achieve what is a balance that's more reflective of the needs of a place, and also making sure that mitigation for harm is part of the decision-making process. Overage, again, was a really important introduction, because what this basically did was go, right, okay, Mr. Developer, Mr. Landowner, we will allow you to negotiate away a proportion of your contributions, but that is for the here and now. We will then require a mechanism to be applied with regards to your to the development, so that your scheme can be reviewed over the life of its delivery. And if it becomes clear that the scheme is making more money than had been anticipated at the point of the viability case, then a proportion or all of that money can be secured for planning gain. The point that I made earlier on is that the PPG is very clear about, we do operate in a plan system, and that viability really should only be a requirement at the plan making stage, where it is assessed for a site through the call for sites process. The landowner promotes a site for development. Then a local authority assesses that site against a set criteria. One of those criteria is deliverability. That assesses the viability of that site and its ability to be delivered and to meet all the policy requirements. The view that is taken in the MPPF/PPG is that should really be the one time at which viability is assessed. If there is a requirement to assess it at the decision-taking stage, i.e. when the planning application is made on that allocated site, then there should be a very, very good reason for why that scheme is being assessed. And in fact, that is defined in the PPG. It sets out a series of reasons, which if anybody is interested in the detail of this stuff, I'm very happy to come back and answer that after the presentation. But that's a really important element of this, because what I'm sure that you've all seen, again, if you're involved in this world, is that decision taking, viability assessments at the planning application stage are still at the heart of viability. The system suggests that it really shouldn't be, unless you have a very, very good reason why not, which means that viability should be assessed, well, should be presented at the pre-app stage, and only if the authority is prepared to accept that there is a case made, an exceptional circumstance has been identified, can a viability case then be made. Again, that's been missed by, I would say, 90% of the practitioners who operate in this space, including those planning officers, etc. And the final point is the key one, is that any assessment should be based on the fact that the scheme is fully compliant because it's already been viability tested. Huge amount of information that I recognise, but it's really important that 2018 was a major change, or saw a major change in how viability is to be assessed. A lot of people, including planning officers in local authorities, are still operating in a pre-2018 world. And that's what Chris and I spend a huge amount of our time in terms of the education process. Next slide, please, Chris. So we've gone through the why. And as I said earlier, it's about making sure that sites that are being identified for development are deliverable. And we're now going into the section of the how. This, I think, is probably the best diagram if you wanted to provide a relatively straightforward explanation of what constitutes viability in development. So everything runs off the assessment of the value of a development. So if I use an example of a scheme, suburban housing scheme of 100 units, what is the value attributed to those 100 units? Now, the presentation comes further onto this, but using the residual method, that value is a hypothetical value. It's a value that is set at a particular point in time, taking into account the values that are pertaining at that time, and it assumes that all those 100 homes are available on a single day, sold on a single day, and generate a price that is reflected in the gross development value, the value of the development. So that's how you get to the left-hand box. What's the value of the development? And then with regards to the next box in terms of how that's broken down into 4 separate boxes, they are the constituent parts of the value of the development. So first and foremost, without the land, there is no development. The core ingredients, that is number 1 in terms of the constituent parts. Then you've got the cost of delivering the development, the putting in of the infrastructure, the building of the homes, and the other 2 elements are then what is an appropriate profit, as in to return to the developer who is delivering that development, and then right at the top you have the planning obligations, and the planning obligations are those that have been set through the plan making process, which, as I said earlier, have already been viability tested to make sure that they are deliverable. Next box, again, as you can see, the value of development has not changed, but what has changed in this explanation of viability and what is deemed to be viable and unviable is the right-hand column. And as you can see with the right-hand column, the constituent parts have changed. So, for example, the development costs have increased. The value of the land, as a result of the development costs increasing, has reduced. The return, interestingly enough, this is an RICS produced document, the return has not changed. The reason that the return has not changed is because house builders assess their return as a percentage of value, not a percentage of cost, like in most other industries in the world. It's a percentage of value. So if the value doesn't change, the percentage remains the same, the return to the developer remains the same. But as you can see at the top, the box that gets squeezed is the planning obligations box. So I think, let's say that this is a 2012 diagram. 2018 and the changes to the PPG should have resulted in the return to the developer also being taken into account when considering the planning balance and the share to get to that planning balance.
Murray, can I interrupt? Like you said,
Yeah.
I could. I've got some good questions about this chart. So I'm going to start with from Simon Thomas. I'll come back to the first one, Simon, in a minute. But what's the typical cost split between the land building costs, profit and planning obligations? And actually that ties in with someone else asking about the typical profit that a developer would expect. They're asking if it was a 35% profit that developers expect. I think it's a bit lower than that. But yeah, do you mind just dealing with that?
Yes, of course. So we've done quite a lot of research into development costs over the last 5 or 6 years, and what's been clear through viability and planning is that this is the area which has seen the greatest movement. So anybody who's as old as I am and been in the development industry for a long time will remember the mantra of a third, a third, a third. So back in the day, before planning obligations were, so pre-1990, there was an expectation that land would be a third of the value, costs would be a third of the value, and the return, the profit to the developer would be a third of the value. That over recent years has fundamentally changed, and we have seen costs as high as 75%, up to, indeed, we've seen them as high as 80% as a proportion of the value. And one of the areas that has driven this is the assessment of what's, I would say, euphemistically called abnormal costs. These are costs that are regarded as being not normal when it comes to assessing development. And this, as a proportion of the development process or the viability process, they've increased hugely. So our expectation has always been that costs as a proportion of development should be somewhere around 60 to 65%, which should leave 30 to 40% in terms of the share for those other elements. If we see costs of between 70 and 80, it makes us very suspicious. With regard to development profit is an area whereby the PPG provides guidance, and it is nothing more than that with regards to applying a development profit at the plan making stage. And what is stated there is that there should be an expectation of between 15 and 20% of the value of development from a developer. That is, as I say, it was much needed in terms of guidance on what a competitive return was, but the whole essence of development is that it's an assessment of risk. And so each development really should have its own risk profile, and the profit that is generated out of that development should reflect that risk. Now, what I often get is that, oh, well, we need 20% to reflect the fact that this development is in a location where We're not sure about land conditions. We haven't done the investigations yet. There could be substantial abnormal costs, so we need that reflected in the profit. My view on that is, well, as you can see by the box on the right-hand side here, is that that's all in the development cost bit. What the return is, it's a commodity return, which is the developer is assessing, using my example of 100 homes, they're assessing at a point in time what they believe the value that those houses will generate. So what will each house sell for, the predicted value, and over what time period will those houses be sold. And that's where the risk is, because I think anybody would accept, and I don't think I'm in any way being unreasonable here to the development fraternity, that building estate housing in suburban locations is a relatively risk-free exercise, in that those houses will be sold, and unless there is a catastrophic change in economic circumstances, then aspirations with regards to values achieved will be met. And if they're not, so 2008 being a prime example, then the developer will stop building, and will start building again when values come back to the level at which they can make a return. So I am not although the guidance says 15 to 20% on value is appropriate in terms of development at the plan making stage, I think each case should be assessed on its merits with regards to profit. And if it's a suburban housing scheme, there needs to be a very, very robust justification for why, if a house sells, for example, for £500,000, why £100,000 of that value should go to the developer to reflect a risk assessment.
Thank you. So before you move on slides, I've got one more here. So we've got, I'm assuming Alison Wheelhouse, you might have to put a confirmation on this, but actual costs paid by the developer to acquire the land isn't the figure used on the costs side of the equation. Is this going to change? Currently, developer can sit on land, then use existing use value plus an uplift. This falsely increases cost.
So EUV plus, as identified before in the PPG change, means that in terms of how viability is assessed, is landowners stroke developers are no longer able to use the price paid for land as an excuse for avoiding planning obligations. What there has been is a sort of a manipulation of existing use plus post 2018, whereas there has been the market value of the land based on the fact that it does benefit from a planning consent, which it clearly doesn't until it's granted. But in terms of the hope value that's applied to the site, what a lot of viability practitioners on the developer side do is go, right, this is an EUV plus assessment, existing use plus a premium, and actually all it is the market value of the site split between existing use value and premium. Now, Chris and I have been involved in a major test case planning inquiry relatively recently, Warburton Lane, if people in Trafford, if people want to look it up, where this was fully tested in front of an inspector, and the findings out of that were that there is no direct guidance to what an appropriate premium should be. It needs to be assessed and promoted by a developer, and at the application stage, where if they're running a viability case, to determine what is appropriate, but that it should always be in the context of that full planning obligation should be paid. So to answer the question, the system, in terms of how it's currently set up, is sufficiently robust to be able to fight against those arguments. That's only if you know the intricacies of the process understand, I have used the PPG pretty much on an everyday basis and the 2021 updated RICS guidance to know that that is the case.
Thank you. We'll let you carry on, because otherwise we'll do some of the questions at the end. Otherwise, you'll
okay,
never have a chance to finish.
So we will cover some of the. I can go through some of the slides because clearly the explanations there cover some of those anyway. This is a slide. Existing use value of land, and this goes back to the late 19th century in terms of land value capture, betterment, phrases that people who have been in the planning world will recognise, and it's in essence is how do you value development land? The starting point is clearly what's the value of the land in its current use, the existing use value, and then what is the value of the land when it benefits from a planning consent for a change of use. And that is not it is not a scientific process. It is a process whereby a developer will not get on and develop unless they have secured interest in land. A landowner will not sell their land unless they have a very good idea of what value they are going to achieve for that land. So picking up, Rosie, on one of the questions that was posed earlier on today with regards to land promoters, is that there are three people operating in this world, in essence, in terms of land promotion. You've got the landowner who clearly needs to be enticed to promote their land for development. You've got the land promoter, and there are a number of them operating. Gladman, until they were purchased relatively recently, were one of the major operators in this field, who will take the risk of pursuing planning applications on land that they don't own. What they do is they secure what's called an option, which is a restriction on title. And what that option does is it allows them then to spend money at risk to get a planning consent. If they are successful with that planning consent, then there will be a negotiation on the appropriate price to pay for that land with the benefit of a planning consent. Sometimes it can be done whereby values are set in advance of that, but by and large, the options process is a landowner enters into an option with a land promoter, they promote the land, and once they've got a planning consent, they then sell the land on to house builders with the benefit of a planning consent. And they get their return from a percentage of the uplift in land value. So they are motivated to achieve the best land value that they can. You've then got the house builder, the developer, and to them land is a cost in the same way that materials are a cost, and they will seek to pay. I say as little that they will seek to minimise the amount that they are required to pay for land, because their interest is not in the land, their interest is in the profit they make from building houses, which in terms of in the 21st century, the profit they make from delivering houses is considerably greater than it is in terms of value of land. And there is often, and I know that there are some very set views on land banking and what land banking is, what its purpose. A developer, by and large, does not land bank to see the value of the land increase, because that's for them, that's a relatively small number getting to a number that relative is not that much bigger with regards to the growth in land value over time, because they're not selling the land. They retain the land to build houses on. They're only holding it back because their intention is to undersupply the market to maintain price. So there is, I say, you've got those three operators within the world of development land, and the establishing of the value of that land is the key element to it. And that's what the residual land value methodology does. It basically incorporates, so here's the predicted value of the development. So that, again, the 100 homes. Here's the cost of achieving, of delivering that development. Here's the profit I need to be able to warrant me wanting to deliver that development, and the finance cost in terms of if I need to borrow money. And what remains after all the costs are taken out is the residual sum, the amount that I can pay for land. Now, what tends to happen is clearly there is another cost line in there, which is planning contributions. As was demonstrated in the previous bar chart, the planning contributions is the bit that tends to get squeezed in viability and planning through the utilisation of the residual method. One of the reasons for that is that by and large, options agreements will have a clause in them which states that the promoter of the land is required to minimise contributions to maximise the land value that is then paid. And these, as I say, these are very regularly used agreements between landowner and promoter. And at the heart of them is something that goes against, in essence, the whole of planning policy, which is planning policy is there to mitigate against the harm caused by the development process. And for me, I think that there needs to be a reevaluation with regards to incorporating those clauses in options agreements. How and where that's done, I don't know. Government is really the only place that it can be sorted out. But it's a concern I've had for quite some time, and it's not going away. Next slide, please, Chris. So again, those involved in the world of appraisal, of viability, may have seen, or will have seen one of these documents, which just is in essence how do you get to a residual output that is the price that somebody will pay for the land. You have all the constituent parts that go into that appraisal, and the last bit that falls out is the land value. Next slide, please, Chris. We've discussed gross development land value. I think we can crack on through that. So there are two areas. I referred earlier on to what's called abnormal costs. There are the normal costs. So what if we're talking about, which we are, residential, what are the standard build costs, i.e. what's called as the plot costs and the external works, and how should they be assessed? The PPG is relatively clear. That there are national indices that help to guide you, but the latest RICS guidance again is very clear that if at the decision-taking stage, the whole point of the decision-taking stage is more details should be known about the proposed development, and so the costs associated with that development should be better understood than just using a national indices. Again, anybody who's involved in this area, that's an important development within the last 18 months to 2 years. Again, abnormal costs. Contingency, we mentioned before about risk, and the cost side of the appraisal already has a risk management element incorporated within it, which is the contingency. And that contingency is there to protect against cost increase. But clearly, in terms of the development process, the things that certainly the top 10 national house builders are incredibly good at because of their buying power is controlling and managing cost.
Murray, I've got two quick-fire questions on abnormal costs.
Yeah.
One is the transparency of them, should people be allowed to see them? And the other is when a cost is known before, like an unusual decontamination cost, for example, if it was previously known, should it not be put into the main costs and not be classified as abnormal?
Okay. I'll answer the second question first, if I may, which is in terms of treating costs that are known, then the PPG is very clear that abnormal costs are a cost to the land. So what that should do, as I say, if it is a contamination, then that should be a deduction from the land value. So if you're looking at the existing use value plus model, that means your premium is a smaller number based on the fact that your land has problems and its value should be impacted upon based on the fact that it has those problems. So that would be my strong recommend. It shouldn't sit within a cost line. Because what that does is that then you get to a place where you get double bubble, is because it will be in the cost estimate of the appraisal, and based on the residual, as we're explaining, is that all of the residual costs lead to potentially reducing the planning gain that's available if they are over and above what was assessed at the plan making stage viability. It really should be, those abnormal costs that are known figures should be a deduction from land value. And Rosie, forgive me, the reason that I went second first, because you could remind me of what the first question was.
Yeah, it's are people allowed to demand to see abnormal costs, for example? What are the transparency rules?
Okay, so as explained earlier, the PPG is very much geared to plan making. It does, of course, reference decision taking, but it doesn't go into the level of detail at the decision taking stage that it probably needed to. But then it assumes that you don't need to do decision taking viability assessments only in very unusual circumstances. So where's best to go? And my recommendation would be the RICS updated guidance 2021, where it's very clear that at the decision-taking stage, a developer who has gone through the planning process, who has spent a lot of money creating a planning application, should have the requisite detail with regards to the cost associated to that development. So you absolutely should be asking at that point to see a cost plan which details those abnormal costs and how those abnormal costs are treated from the basis of an outline application, maybe a major scheme with an environmental statement. They might not be known at that stage, but certainly an estimate can be drawn up of what, based on the level of assessment that's been undertaken through the environmental statement. There should be a series of conclusions that can be reached on an allocation of costs for abnormals. So the process now should be very clear that you can't hide behind, we don't know them, so we're just going to put in this huge allocation of costs, and that will clearly impact on the planning gain that will be generated.
Thank you. I'll let you carry on.
Okay, thanks. So fees, again, we often have a debate about fees in terms of if any of you who are involved anybody driving around the highways and byways of England England and Wales will know that development all looks rather similar. And that's because, basically house builders, certainly the top 10 listed house builders, have a standard product that they understand very well, that they've costed to within an inch of its life, and that's what they want to deliver. That product, by and large, has been designed some time ago. You'll have seen your 15 Windsors and your 30 Ascots and your 24 Aintreys. That's how the system works. And we often have debates with house builders about, well, how much design, how in terms of your architectural fees, which you're applying a percentage to with regards to the scheme that you're delivering here, is appropriate to apply. And so that, again, that's an area that I think is worth challenging, because the fee estimates on some of these, certainly on the larger schemes, they can get to fabulous size, and always best to challenge whether these fees are actually being incurred. Next slide, please, Chris. So just a commentary with regards to one of the key areas. So affordable housing is clearly, in terms of planning contributions, is a very, very important area, because it's primarily the way that the country is now delivering the housing stock to those in need, those people who need some form of subsidy to live and sit outside the normal workings of the market. If those houses are to be delivered by and large through Section 106 agreements, then we feel that there should be a very good reason why, if they've been tested, if they've been viability tested at the plan making stage or core strategy stage, then that they should be an important part of a contribution through the development process. Just to briefly explain how that works in the context of a development, is that the affordable housing product on a scheme, I'll go back to my 100-unit scheme again, if the affordable housing policy provision is 30%, 30 of those units are required to be affordable. What does that mean? It means that the price that is paid for those units by a registered provider, housing association, is a discount to the market. And on average, that discount to the market is in the region of 40%, depending on the mix, which means that your house builder will be incurring the full cost of delivering that house, but they will only be receiving 60% of its value. So one thing that is in terms of the heart of viability and planning, and a lot of people talk about land as the key area of contention and the valuing of land and how that works. For me, right at the epicenter of the debate with regards to affordable housing is that developers, in terms of how they make their money off delivering houses, get a percentage of the value of that house. If the value of that house is on average 40% less, and the costs you are incurring to deliver it are the same, then there is a real motivation for you to attempt to turn that affordable house into a market house, because if you do, you simply make more money. The percentage is the same, but it's a percentage of a smaller number. If you've got so just one of those points that I think it's people that say there's a huge amount of focus on land and how to value land and land value capture. I think developer profit is also another key area that people should consider. The appraisal that Chris showed earlier on is that what sits behind that appraisal, and this is another really important area in terms of viability, is that it assumes, as I said, in this hypothetical world, that all houses are sold for the same price on the same day, but it also needs to assess, if you're borrowing money to deliver that development, over what period are you borrowing that money, and what are your interest charges that you need to pay. And we use a software package called Argus Developer, which very kindly works it out for us. And so you can apply through to work out what in essence your interest charges will be, and at what point you pay back any money that you've borrowed. So this is part of that process, and quite often we'll just see a fixed figure. It clearly needs to be worked out through a methodical approach to assessing your interest charges on an annual basis and more. We've talked about profit, and we can move on from there. Residual land value, we've clearly covered at length. so this is, again, the existing use value approach to establishing an appropriate value for a site. One of the things to be very clear about here is that benchmark land value and the approach to benchmark land value is not something that the RICS utilises when valuing land. This is something, and RICS, in terms of a lot that it's written, it has written, is that this is not a method that they necessarily support. Say that the approach through, people will have heard of a red book valuation with regards to assessing the value of land, does not follow the requirements of EUV plus. And this, I think, remains a challenge for those operating in the industry. Valuers of land, who a lot of people who are practitioners in viability and planning are surveyors, valuers. Their professional body requires them to value land outside of viability and planning in a certain way, and then when they operate in the viability and planning world, they are required to suspend that approach and use a different approach, and that can lead to confusion, and it also can lead to sort of perverse outcomes when it comes to existing use value and its approach. So that's something to be wary of. I referenced Warburton Lane before, so this was a major planning application where I appeared as an expert witness with Chris supporting me. And this was a scheme of 400 units being promoted in Trafford. Those of you who know the Northwest region will know that Trafford, in part, is probably one of the most desirable places to live in the Northwest. It has places like Altrincham and Bowden that you may have heard of. 400 unit scheme, and the proposition from the developer was that the scheme was unable to deliver a single affordable house and remain viable. Just as a general comment, if anybody ever sees an argument like that, it clearly is not a credible argument. This scheme, the developer would have delivered it if it was delivering 10, 20 affordable units. That would not have changed the viability, the financial viability of the proposition. Any schemes that do come forward suggesting, certainly schemes of scale that suggest nil contribution, I'm always highly skeptical, because, as I say, I don't think it is a credible argument based on the fact that this is a viability of the development process. And we reviewed all the information that was presented to us by the other side. This was a job that we've been working on for about 2 years in terms of to and froing through the decision-taking viability process. We were, and going back to, there was a question asked about abnormal costs earlier on. The main contention in this was abnormal costs and the sheer scale of what was being suggested would be abnormal costs on this site. Pleasingly, the inspector supported our position on that, and that was that the abnormal costs that were presented in a cost plan were not credible, and based on that, it was asserted that the scheme was capable of delivering its full contribution of 45%. We understand that the developer is gearing themselves up to a second application on the site and may well be pursuing the same argument they did the first time round. We look forward to it. So that is, that's the point that I have just made, which is that if a scheme delivers even a single affordable house, it's unviable. What this plays into is a tactic, which a lot of those practitioners operating in the world of viability, and I'm not necessarily being critical because it doesn't say anywhere in the PPG and RICS guidance that this isn't an approach that you can take. But what we see a lot of is planning applications with a viability case where the promoter, the applicant, is saying this scheme isn't viable, and it isn't viable irrespective of contributions. So the fact that it's not viable means we don't need to pay any contributions. Our response to that, of course, is, well, if it's not viable, irrespective of contributions, why should it be given a planning consent because it's not deliverable? To which we get the response, well, that's not for you to determine, that's for the council to determine through the LPA. So again, that's one to be very wary of, is that the whole essence of viability and planning, as we discussed right at the beginning, is that if the local authority, the LPA, is flexible with their policy, can they make a scheme that's unviable viable? So if they have a policy, for example, on affordable housing that's 30%, and the developer is saying, look, we can make this work at 15, but if it's below that, it's going to be really challenging. If the council is prepared to say, okay, we accept 15%, we are flexible with our policy, then that for me is the essence of viability and planning. If a developer comes forward with a case that says, this scheme, irrespective of whether there's affordable housing, Section 106 contributions or not, makes minus 5 million, which we see quite often, not that sort of figure, makes no profit at all, makes negative land value, then that is not a matter for viability and planning, because there is nothing that the LPA can do by flexing their policy that will make that scheme viable. Just one to watch out for. This is potentially a little contentious depending on the audience, but there is a suggestion, I think, in how this is all treated, is that there is a bit of a conflict of interest in that those who promote land for sale, acting as agents on behalf of landowners or purchase land on behalf of developers, also operate in the viability and planning area, seeking to negotiate away contributions. The fee structure for those operating in the world of land agency is to benefit from a percentage of the land value achieved. In the same way that if you're selling your house, the estate agent will benefit from a percentage of the price that has been achieved in that sale. Land agents operate in the same way. Clearly, the greater the planning commitments on a planning in relation to an application, the greater the contribution to affordable housing, to Section 106 contributions, the smaller the land value. The smaller the land value, the smaller the fee that is received by the party who's promoting that land. It's not something that the RICS has ever sought to deal with or comment on, and I just think it is an area that needs to be understood better, and how a conflict of interest is dealt with. I know how it is dealt with. It's all of the viability assessments that you ever see done by a member of the RICS are independent and objective. I'll leave everybody to dwell on that.
Brilliant. Oh, sorry, I thought you just finished. I was going to say thank you, but
no. It's it just, in terms of timing, we're virtually on. We're virtually at the point. As thank you all for giving up your Tuesday evenings to listen to me. Hopefully, it was of use. I could carry on for another few hours, as you can probably tell, but I promise I won't put you through that. So hopefully, Rosie, that was okay.
It was spot on. Thank you so much. We've got millions of questions. We're not going to have I might do one or two quickly before we go, but Murray said very kindly before we started this evening that he's happy to look at some of the questions afterwards, so we will try and bolt them into categories and send them across tomorrow, because there's loads in the chat and loads in the Q&A, so thank you for all those. And yeah, one quick one was, well, I say it's quick, it's easy for me to say, isn't it? What's to stop a company setting up a shell company, buying the land for X million, then anonymously selling the land back to itself for 2 times X million and gaming the calculation?
In terms of RICS land valuation, they shouldn't be able to do it in terms of, because it's the valuing of the land which is the key, and unless somebody is acting, let me say, inappropriately, the value of the land is the value of the land. And that is determined through a process which should be a relatively exacting process of how you get to assessing that value. Should that be through using the comparable method or using the residual method? One would strongly recommend that it should be a combination of the two, certainly if there is limited comparable evidence. So that should not be permitted to happen based on the fact that the land would require to be valued. If it's somebody just operating in an uncontrolled environment, then I can't give you the answer.
No, that's fine. Thank you. Actually, one thing we're thinking, you say you could keep going for hours. I'm wondering if we should see if you might want to come back another time and perhaps sort of do the next stage potentially, but we can talk about that afterwards. So a final question, I don't know how quickly you can answer this one. It's about garden communities, which clearly are over a very long time scale. The question is, if there's a viability appraisal, and I happen to know the one being asked about, it's in the local plan, it's going for planning application. Is it realistic to work on a viability model for 35 years? And are there some ways of discrediting it over such a long period of time? In a quick answer. I know it's a long answer, but
yeah. So there are different ways of assessing value, and from my perspective, from Chris's perspective, if you are looking at a development that will take a substantial amount of time to deliver, then you need to look at a cash flow model with regards to how you assess the performance of that development over time. Looking at a present value approach, the residual that I explained earlier on is inappropriate for a scheme that will take 15 to 20 years to deliver. And I think based on that any assessment that is done of, let's say, a garden village proposal of between 2 and 10,000 units should be done on the basis that it is assessed on a regular basis throughout its life, to work out exactly what it's able to afford at a given time through the process, because then you can track house price growth over time. You can track land value growth over time, also track cost increase over time, and that is in essence what the PPG was getting at with regards to the overage agreements. But I would strongly recommend that anybody looking at something of that nature does not fix the outputs if they are not to policy compliance at day one.
Okay, brilliant, thank you. Now, look, everyone, I'm really sorry. I'm going to have to wrap up purely actually because I have to go and get my children. So I have to go. Murray, that was really, really interesting, incredibly useful. So much covered in a short space of time. I think if people need stuff to take away, it's go and get used to familiarise yourself with the 2018 Planning Practice Guidance on Viability and the RICS 2021 guidance. So learn those. And
it's all in there. And if anybody wants an explanation of what certain things mean, Chris and I are happy to assist. In fact, we've done a review of that, which I can let you have, Rosie, that you can circulate to people if they think that would be useful.
That'd be brilliant. Thank you. Excellent. Okay, well, I very much appreciate your time. Thank you very much for that. And thank you, everyone, so many of you for attending. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Appreciate it.
Bye. Bye.
Bye now.